You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday the 10th of August. UK to give £5 million to rebels in Syrian conflict. We are paying for jails in Jamaica and Nigeria to be nicer. Iraqi living off fat of the land in UK turns to crime. Olympics, war and a national festival threatened from the Welsh valleys with Nick MEP. Egyptian troops kill 20 in Sinai. Former imam keeps Russian children in dark for a decade. Thought for the day, am I uncharitable? And finally, Mohammed arrested for sodomy in Copenhagen. UK news. The right thing to do has been quoted by Foreign Secretary William Hague as he prepares to hand over an extra £5 million in non-lethal equipment to the Free Syrian Army. This extra practical support for the rebels will include more radio and satellite equipment as well as portable power generators. James Robbins of the BBC says that it is a significant shift in policy after frustration about Syria's opposition. A World at 8 reporter comments, if Hague thinks that most of this money will not go towards arms, he is stupider or more devious than we already thought. The extra radio equipment will do nicely for old propaganda pictures to the outside world. This shows the powers that be thought this would all be over and the Islamic rebels in place much sooner than President Assad has allowed. This is the writing on the wall for any free Arab states left. Beware the West and the UN. They will throw money at you that their countries can ill afford. The UK government is paying to refit foreign prisons so that foreign criminals can serve their sentences in their homeland. Our ministers are desperate to assuage the Human Rights Brigade whilst trying to accommodate the rising numbers of foreign criminals in our penal system. The true figures of how many ethnic varieties are in our UK prisons has never been truthfully published, but the fact that the main foreign prisons to be refitted at our taxpayers' expense are Nigeria and Jamaica throws some light on them. Apparently by March 2011 there were 11,127 foreigners behind bars, and these are costing the UK public purse more than £420 million. This annual refit pot of £3 million is because our jails are simply too full to accommodate many more. A World at 8 writer comments, this is the other side of unmonitored immigration. That of the internal structure of a society breaking down at great expense to our own people. Our prison service is at the end of a long line of services which have been and are still becoming non-services. But it will be money well spent if they actually send anyone back. Nasir Muhsin, 18, claimed to be so poor he had to loot and steal, but in reality this teenager and his extensive family were given a £3 million flat in Kensington to live in, and still he joined fellow rioters last summer. Found guilty of being part of a rampaging mob who terrorised the streets of London and robbed the customers of a 4-star Michelin restaurant during the riots last year. Laughing as he was taken down for a 6-year jail sentence, he's quoted as saying, "I want more, I want to remain in prison." His family trashed their 6-bedroom flat and it took 10 days of builders to repair it. They are described as animals. With Muhsin were a motley band of multicoloured youths, all with previous records. Calum Hines, 26, jailed for 9 years yesterday. Ali Abdul Wagga, 20, 7 years. Amin Ibrahim, 17, 33 months. Rico Myers, 16, 4 years. Karim Landriguez, 16, 3-year rehabilitation order. Jazz Dedier, 18, 18 months. Ahmed Al-Jaff, 19, 9 years, and Tyler Brewer, 19, 4 years. From the Vale of Glamorgan and the Welsh Dragon, I give you Olympics and War with Nick MEP.
Well, as Parliament shut for the summer, I might normally use this radio slot to discuss things in the news. But I'm at a disadvantage this week because I haven't really seen or heard very much news. That's because I'm trying to avoid looking at newspapers. By the way, I mean online, because no nationalist should ever buy a mainstream newspaper and give money to the people who only ever lie about us. And I'd rather not watch or listen to broadcast media while the giant multicult bread and circus fest is on. Yes, it is good that the victories of British athletes in a surprising number of sports will encourage a lot of youngsters to take them up. to enjoy themselves, to get fit, and to learn the self-discipline that's such an important part of sport. But that's the great thing about participation sport. It's the mind-numbing phenomenon of over-commentated spectator sport that irritates me. One rugby game's fine, so's a boat race or a boxing match, or indeed any kind of athletic discipline, as a one-off. When it's wall-to-wall, it's just too much, especially when the liberal, globalist corporate media take every possible opportunity to abuse their power, to force-feed their gigantic, brains-in-neutral audience with multicult claptrap. It makes me want to enter trials for a new event, throwing the TV out of the window. Having got that off my chest, let's move on to look at the bright side. At least the poison of leftist egalitarianism hasn't yet gone so far as to insist that no one should be allowed to win at the Olympics, on the grounds that it might hurt the loser's feelings. That would imply having 2 solid weeks of TV showing nothing except synchronised swimming, and even the relentless pressure to conform, watch and enjoy that we've been subjected to for the last week will be hard-pressed to keep the audience ratings under those circumstances. Since the corporate sponsors wouldn't take kindly to that, the distinctly anti-egalitarian ethos at the heart of competitive sport should be safe for a while yet. By the way, I'm sorry about the background noise on this recording. The haymaking is in full swing here, and there's nowhere to get away from the sound of tractors trundling up and down the surrounding fields. But back to the Olympics. Taking into account the fact that Britain's population is so much smaller than China's or America's, we even beat them hands down in terms of medals to people ratio. The good thing about this British success was the discomfort felt by the BBC over the simple patriotic pride this induced in the public. The revelation that the BBC felt compelled to order its commentators to avoid sounding patriotic and to play up the successes of other countries at the expense of wins by Team GB would have struck a raw nerve with millions of decent sports lovers who normally don't give a second thought to politics. Anything that boosts awareness of the institutionally racist, anti-British nature of the Blatant Bias Corporation has to be welcomed. Still, whether you like the Olympics or not, they'll soon be over, whereupon the controlled media will have to find some fresh spectacle for us. In the words of the old Gary Newman song, they could give us a war just to keep us amused. There are, of course, several suitable candidates being lined up with the neocon, Zionist, Saudi Arabian usual suspects. Anyone for civil war in Syria? How about an attack on Iran? I'm pretty sure that the people who want our soldiers and tax money for that particular venture won't be deterred by the fact that successive US intelligence reports have concluded that Iran is not trying to make a nuclear bomb. The controlled media hysterias of the contrary is, of course, nothing more than a rerun of a weapons of mass destruction lie to hoax us into the illegal and totally counterproductive war on Iraq. But war is a racket, such a profitable racket to the corporations who own most mainstream politicians, that, one way or another, we're bound to be involved in another one before too long. At the moment, I'm reading The Winter of the World, a searing anthology of poetry from the First World War. Many of the best poems in it are by soldiers, of whom very few people have now ever heard. Others are by famous poets, such as Brooke, Sassoon, Owen, or Thomas. Some are jingoistic, others by pacifists. All speak across the years of the great Holocaust of our kith and kin. All, in some way or another, remind us of the need to expose and oppose the warmongers who are out there still, pouring onto the printing presses and into the airwaves the poison that sets nation against nation, so they might have their way, have their war, and make their profits. Gertrude Ford's A Fight to a Finish, penned in 1917, as the Battle of Passchendaele claimed 250,000 British casualties and 400,000 Germans, is every bit as topical today. Fight the year out, the warlords said. What said the dying among the dead? For the last man, cried the profiteers. What said the poor in the starveling years? Fight on, the armaments kings besought. Nobody asked what the women thought. One of those slaughtered during Passchendaele was Hayth Wyn, a Welsh language poet serving with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, who fell on the 31st of July on Pilgrim Ridge. Hayth had submitted a poem to that year's National Eisteddfod, the Welsh Cultural Festival. His entry won the poetry competition, but since he'd already been killed in action, the empty bard's chair was draped in black. The Eisteddfod, however, lives on to this day. In fact, it was held this week in the Vale of Glamorgan, when hundreds of thousands of Welsh speakers gathered for 3 days of intense competition to extraordinarily high standards in song, poetry, dance, art, and literature. The participation rate amongst youngsters is particularly high and enthusiastic. Mine made it to the main stage several times during their school years, and seeing them competing so well in the language of some of my ancestors was a huge thrill. Virtually unknown among the huge English-speaking majority in these small islands, the Eisteddfod is a living gem indigenous culture, which vies with Ulster's 12th of July as the greatest non-commercialised folk festival in the whole of Western Europe. And, born as it was, as part of the resistance to a relentless assault on the Welsh language and culture, it is a model the indigenous English now need to learn from and adopt as the multicult genocide machine crushes our identity into the dust. So it was with anger that I heard yesterday that the political and media elite are now using the inevitable funding crisis as the opportunity to demand that the Eisteddfod, which by its very nature is unashamedly Welsh and hence hideously white, as the BBC's Greg Dyke put it, should become inclusive and multicultural. I hope that my Welsh friends and neighbours, busy making hay at the moment, who perhaps have tried to kid themselves that the cultural wrecking ball of anti-racist globalism might stop at the Shropshire border, will now realise that their identity is next on the hit list. I hope they will realise that they cannot run and hide or beg the liberal totalitarians to leave them alone, and I hope that they will see that they must stand their ground and fight. Because, you see, despite my sympathy for pacifism in the European Brothers' War of 1914 to 18, I'm not a pacifist. I believe that sometimes war is justified, and that fighting evil is always a duty. And believe me, the thing that would wipe out the heritage and language of Heath Wyn and obliterate forever the England and the English of Rupert Brooke is evil, and it must be fought by all means necessary.
Thank you very much, Nick, for your usual brilliant input. Thank you. World news. Egyptian troops killed 20 in Sinai. Early this week saw the first offensive action on the Sinai Peninsula since the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Egyptian troops launched a military action against at least 20 Islamic extremists. President Mohamed Morsi has vowed to restore order to Sinai, which has become a lawless province since the revolution that toppled President Hosni Mubarak last year. Troops have raided hundreds of homes to track down terror suspects and seized thousands of weapons being hoarded by Bedouin extremists. Over 2,000 Islamic extremists are thought to operate from Sinai, where more than the 600,000 population are Bedouin and denied Egyptian citizenship. A cruel Muslim, former imam and self-styled prophet, yet another, Faiz Rahman Sattarov, 83, of Kazan in the eastern region of Tatarstan, kept 27 children in dark and unheated cells, some for over 10 years. The children, aged from 1 year to 17 years, were amongst 70 followers of Sattarov ordered to stay underneath a 3-storey house, with no ventilation or heating. Sattarov has apparently declared the derelict house an independent Islamic state and only allowed a few to leave the cells to work at the local market. The children's parents are being charged with child abuse and Sattarov faces charges of negligence. Short thought for the weekend. Am I being uncharitable? I'm sure my listeners would tell me if I'm being uncharitable or failing to see the needs of our immigrant population, wouldn't you? But I watched the ITV programme last night on the Asian Ugandans and really had to be tied down for fear of inflicting injuries on the television itself. The sycophantic tones of the sodding reporter and the airy-fairy way in which the entire problem of immigration, starting with that one, was as usual ignored. I gather that things were not good in Uganda under Amiens, but let's face it, he got rid of the monkey from his back by passing them on to us, and in a way that no one could really condemn. He just would not guarantee their safety if they stayed, much like in India during partition for the Anglo-Indians, and what goes around comes around. The Hindus fared better over here with integrating because, although highly aggravating at the best of times, they are a gentler people usually than the Muslim Asians, who came over here and immediately took over Leicester and various other northern cities en masse. The programme harped on about racism as if one people from one culture should immediately adore and accept peoples from totally different cultures into their land. I had to turn off that recording because I was in serious danger of spontaneous combustion. Of course, all that has been worn down now by the multicultural bollocks that I spoke about on Wednesday. Now it is not accepted by the authorities that anyone could have genuine misgivings about giving the ever-increasing Muslim hordes a foothold in our society without being a raving lunatic. I'm trying to marry up the very nice Hindu and Muslim ladies who apparently left something akin to Bergen-Belsen in Uganda and arrived in the lovely unenriched England of the 70s. They turned Uganda into pre-war Berlin with their conniving and, surprise, surprise, have set about doing exactly the same thing over here. Money makes the world go round and no one can deny them their success on the backs of the English and our successive governments. I'm also trying to come to terms with the similar problem of Nasir Musen, whose Muslim family apparently warranted a £3 million flat in a London upper-class block of flats on arriving in the UK, which they of course subsequently trashed, and he is in prison for looting. When we in this country are paying huge amounts of foreign aid, mainly to Muslim, Indian and African countries, even going so far to avoid deportation of their foreign criminals because the prisons that await them in their homelands are not yet fit for purpose, until we lay out £3 million a year just for that, whilst our elderly and sick are denied medicines in a so-called postcode lottery. Of course it is not a postcode lottery, it is a racist lottery, an anti-white lottery, and it is so transparent and obvious that it is never called what it is. For fear of what? Upsetting the natives? Hardly. They're laughing my friends from their subsidised flats to their free education and healthcare, on to university or the nearest prison. I am not afraid to say that most, if not all these freeloaders, however well-meaning they appear or sound, are just that, freeloaders and opportunists. It was the best thing in some ways that Amiens did. He reduced his country to a wasteland, not by expelling thousands of Asians, but simply by being mad. Perhaps it takes a madman to see the truth sometimes, but I hope not. Although we do have plenty of madmen in government now, but they seem hell-bent on having an Islamic state in the UK, despite seriously running out of money to implement it. Thank God, not Allah. And finally, Mohammed arrested for sodomy in Copenhagen. Police have arrested 2 men accused of raping a 22-year-old man in a park in Copenhagen early Thursday morning. One of them forced the victim to the ground whilst his pal raped him anally. In spite of his ordeal, the young man gave a good description of the criminals. His rapist had the name Mohammed tattooed on his arm. He was about 25 and of Middle Eastern appearance. Of the 2 subsequently arrested, both are from Iran and one is 25 years old with a tattoo. A World at 8 reporter commented, "I deplore this crime. I suppose it is understandable why homosexuals flee Iran, but if you want to rape other men and do not want to be caught, it's not advised to have your name tattooed on your arm." You have been listening to the World at 8. I am Lynn Mozar, and I and the team at World at 8 and Radio Britain wish you all a very happy and a very safe weekend. £5 million to rebels in Syrian conflict. We are paying for jails in Jamaica and Nigeria to be nicer. Iraqi living off fat of the land in UK turns to crime. Olympics, war and a national festival threatened from the Welsh valleys with Nick Griffin, MEP. Egyptian troops kill 20 in Sinai. Former imam keeps Russian children in dark for a decade. Thought for the day, am I on chase much sooner than President Assad has allowed? This is the writing on the wall for any free Arab states left. Beware the West and the UN. They will throw money at you that their countries can ill afford. The UK government is paying to refit foreign prisons so that foreign criminals can serve their sentences in their homeland. Our ministers are desperate to assuage the Human Rights Brigade whilst trying to accommodate the rising numbers of foreign...
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozar. The World at 8, the number 1 in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday the 10th of August. UK to give charitable. And finally, Mohammed arrested for sodomy in Copenhagen. UK news. The right thing to do has been quoted by Foreign Secretary William Hague as he prepares to hand over an extra £5 million in non-lethal equipment to the Free Syrian Army. This extra practical support for the rebels will include more radio and satellite equipment as well as portable power generators. James Robbins of the BBC says that it is a significant shift in policy after frustration about Syria's opposition. A World at 8 reporter comments, "If Hague thinks that most of this money will not go towards arms, he is stupider or more devious than we already thought. The extra radio equipment will do nicely for old propaganda pictures to the outside world. This shows the powers that be thought this would all be over and the Islamic rebels in place